The blade of James Harper's spade struck the Nebraska prairie sod with a dull thud. It was August 1867, and his neighbors from the neighboring claims had gathered to watch what they called madness. Harper was digging a hole in the side of a low hill, methodically cutting into the earth with nothing but a shovel and determination. Behind him, his wife Mary stood beside their covered wagon, their 3 children huddled close in the oppressive prairie heat. "You're going to live in a hole like a prairie dog?" Thomas Henderson called out from his partially constructed timber frame house. Henderson had brought lumber all the way from Omaha, hauled it 40 miles at considerable expense. His house stood proud on the flat prairie, visible for miles. "That's no way for a civilized man to live." Harper didn't stop digging. He knew what his neighbors thought. They'd made it clear enough since his family had arrived 3 weeks earlier. The railroad had brought them to the nearest depot, and they'd traveled by wagon to this homestead claim near what would eventually become the town of Kearney. 160 acres of virgin prairie, his under the Homestead Act, passed by Congress in 1862. All he had to do was live on it, improve it, farm it for 5 years, and it would be his. But first he needed shelter. "Gotta get my family under cover before winter," Harper replied, his voice steady. The problem was timber, or rather the complete absence of it. Back in Ohio, Harper had built a proper log cabin. Thick oak logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone fireplace, wooden floor. But here on the Nebraska prairie, the only trees grew in sparse thickets along the few creek beds. Cottonwoods and willows, barely thick enough for firewood, let alone construction. The nearest pine timber was in the canyons 40 miles west, and hauling it would cost more money than Harper had. He'd arrived with $67, a wagon, 2 oxen, farming tools, and enough provisions to last until spring. Every dollar mattered. Lumber from Omaha cost $20 per 1,000 board feet, plus transport. A modest timber house would require 3,000 board feet. That was $60 just for the lumber, not counting nails, windows, doors, or the time lost from breaking prairie sod for crops. It was money he didn't have and time he couldn't spare. So Harper was doing what hundreds of other homesteaders across the Great Plains were doing. He was building a dugout. The concept was simple enough. Dig a rectangular hole into the side of a hill, deep enough to stand in, wide enough for a family to live. Use the earth itself as 3 walls. Build up the 4th wall, the exposed front, with whatever materials you could find. Cover it with a roof. Move in. Simple, but not easy. Harper had chosen his location carefully. He'd walked his entire claim, studying the terrain, before selecting this spot. The hill faced east, which meant the dugout would catch the morning sun. The slope would drain water away from the entrance. The north wind, the killing wind that would howl across these plains, come winter, would pass over the dugout rather than slam into it. The hill sat near a creek bed, close enough for water but high enough to avoid flooding. He'd learned about flooding from another homesteader, a man named Peterson, who dug his dugout right into a creek bank. "Convenient for water," Peterson had said. Then came a thunderstorm in June. Peterson had described how the creek rose 6 feet in less than an hour, how he'd waded through rising water to get his wife and baby out, how they'd lost everything. The dugout became a mud-filled pit. Peterson was building again, higher up this time. Harper marked out the dimensions of his dugout with wooden stakes and rope. 10 feet wide, 14 feet long. It would be cramped for a family of 5, but it would serve. He began digging on the eastern side of the hill, cutting straight into the earth. The prairie sod was unlike anything Harper had encountered back east. Virgin prairie, never plowed, created a mat of grass roots so thick and tangled it could stop a plow blade. Buffalo grass, blue grama, little blue stem, all woven together into a layer 4 to 6 inches thick. This was the sod that would eventually be cut into bricks for building, but here, dug into the hillside, it formed the walls themselves. Harper's spade bit into the sod, and he levered up chunks of it, roots and all. The work was brutal. 6 hours of digging on that first day, and he'd excavated perhaps 3 feet into the hill. His hands blistered despite the calluses he'd built up on the journey west. His back ached. Sweat soaked through his shirt in the August heat. But he kept digging. By the fourth day, Harper had created a cavity 7 feet deep into the hillside. The earth here was dark, rich soil, slightly moist even in the heat of summer. This was the incredible fertility that had drawn homesteaders west, soil that could grow crops beyond anything in the exhausted fields back east. But first, it had to be lived in. On the 5th day, Harper began working on the floor. He dug down another 3 feet below ground level, making the interior height just over 6 feet. Harper stood 5 feet 8 inches tall, average for a man of his time. He'd have to duck slightly under the eventual ceiling, but it would do. The floor he smoothed as best he could with the spade, then sprinkled it with water from buckets carried from the creek. "What are you doing now?" Mary asked, watching him splash water across the dirt floor. "Making it hard," Harper said. "Saw some folks doing this back at the last settlement. Sprinkle water, sweep it smooth with grass, let it dry. Do it again and again. Eventually it packs down hard as wooden planks." Mary nodded. She'd been born in Indiana, raised in a proper house with wooden floors and glass windows. But she'd married Harper knowing he wanted to go west, and she'd never once complained about the hardships. Now she took one of the crude grass brooms Harper had fashioned from prairie grass tied to a stick and helped him sweep the dampened floor smooth. The children helped too, young as they were. Emma, 8 years old, carried water in a small bucket. James, 6, gathered armfuls of prairie grass for the brooms. Even little Sarah, just 4, picked up stones from the floor and carried them outside. The work took 3 days, dampening and sweeping, letting it dry, then doing it again. By the time Harper finished, the floor was hard-packed earth, smooth and solid. Not wood, but serviceable, and it hadn't cost a cent. Now came the front wall. This was the only wall that needed to be built, since the earth formed the other 3 sides and the back. Harper had a choice. He could use sod blocks, cut from the prairie and stacked like bricks, or he could use logs if he could find enough cottonwood. He chose sod. To cut sod blocks, Harper hitched his 2 oxen to his breaking plow. This was the heavy iron plow he'd brought west specifically for breaking prairie sod. The blade could cut through that thick mat of grass roots, turning over an 18-inch ribbon of sod. Harper drove his oxen in long, straight lines, cutting strips of sod across a section of his claim. Then came the cutting. Harper used a spade to cut the long ribbons of sod into 2-foot sections. Each section was roughly 4 to 6 inches deep, a perfect building block. The grass roots held the soil together, creating blocks that wouldn't crumble. Each block weighed about 50 pounds. Harper stacked these sod blocks like bricks, creating a wall at the front of his dugout. He staggered the blocks, overlapping them for strength, just as a mason would lay bricks. The wall rose slowly, 7 feet high, 10 feet wide. He left a space 4 feet wide for a door, and another space 2 feet square for a window. The door and window were luxuries Harper couldn't afford just yet. He'd bought them from a merchant in Omaha before leaving, spending $5 precious. A wooden door, solid pine, with iron hinges. A glass window, single pane, small but real glass. These were hauled carefully in the wagon, wrapped in blankets to prevent breaking. Henderson, the neighbor with the timber house, stopped by on the 8th day to watch Harper work. He'd brought his wife, and they both stared at the dugout taking shape in the hillside. "I'll grant you this," Henderson said. "You're making progress. But, James, that's still just a hole in the ground. When winter comes, when those blizzards hit, you and your family will freeze. Earth can't keep out cold like that." Harper was fitting the door into its frame, adjusting the hinges. He didn't look up. "Earth's a natural insulator," he said. "Holds temperature steady. Cold outside, warm inside, hot outside, cool inside." "That's theory," Henderson said. "Reality's different. Mark my words, come December, you'll be begging to spend the winter in my parlor." Mary, overhearing this, spoke up from where she was helping install the window. "We appreciate your concern, Mr. Henderson, but we'll manage just fine." Henderson shook his head and rode off. His wife threw a pitying glance at Mary before following. Now came the roof, and this was the most critical part of the entire structure. The roof had to be strong enough to support weight, weatherproof enough to keep out rain and snow, and insulated enough to maintain temperature. It also had to be built from materials Harper could actually obtain. Harper rode his oxen cart down to the creek bed and spent 2 days cutting cottonwood poles. Cottonwood wasn't good timber for most purposes, too soft and prone to rot, but it was all he had. He cut poles 8 to 10 inches in diameter, 14 feet long to span the width of his dugout. These poles he laid side by side across the dugout, spanning from the sod front wall to the earth back wall. The poles rested on the sod wall at one end and were sunk into the earth wall at the other, creating a support structure for the roof. Harper placed the poles as close together as possible, leaving minimal gaps between them. On top of the poles, Harper laid a thick layer of prairie grass. Not just any grass, but the long, coarse blue stem that grew tall in the lowlands. This grass was spread 6 inches thick, forming a mat that would prevent dirt from sifting through the cracks between the poles. Then came the sod itself. Harper cut more sod blocks and carefully placed them over the grass layer, creating a double layer of sod bricks across the entire roof. This was heavy, back-breaking work. Each block weighed 50 pounds, and Harper was placing them 10 feet above ground level, standing on the cottonwood poles to position them. The sod was fitted together as tightly as possible, grass side up. Harper left the grass growing on these blocks, knowing that after the first good rain, the grass would continue growing, the roots would knit together, and the roof would become a living, growing mat of prairie grass. When he finished, the dugout was nearly invisible from a distance. The roof blended with the hillside, covered in prairie grass that waved in the wind just like the surrounding prairie. Only the door and window and the small chimney Harper had constructed from stones and mud revealed that this was a human dwelling. The Harper family moved into their dugout on September 3, 1867. They'd been on their claim for exactly 4 weeks. Harper had built the dugout in 12 days of hard labor. The interior was dark. The single window let in some light, but not much. The door, when open, provided more illumination, but when closed against wind or cold, the dugout became dim even at midday. Mary solved this problem partially by saving every candle stub and rendered animal fat for oil lamps. Light was precious in the dugout, measured in hours of candlelight and ounces of lamp oil. The first night, little Sarah cried. She was scared of the dark, scared of the earth walls, scared of this strange underground home. Emma, trying to be brave, held her sister's hand. James, curious rather than frightened, explored every corner of the dugout by candlelight. "It smells like dirt," James announced. "That's because it's made of dirt," Harper said, not unkindly. "You'll get used to it." They did get used to it, though it took time. The dugout was one room, 10 feet by 14 feet, for 5 people. Privacy was impossible. Storage was minimal. The few pieces of furniture they'd brought, a table and 4 chairs, a chest for clothes, Mary's rocking chair, took up most of the available space. The family's bedding was rolled up during the day and spread on the floor at night. But the dugout was shelter, and more than that, it was theirs. No rent to pay. No landlord. This dugout, humble as it was, sat on land that would belong to the Harper family if they could prove up their claim for 5 years. Harper spent September and October breaking prairie sod. This was the essential work of homesteading. The virgin prairie had to be broken, the sod turned over, before crops could be planted. The breaking plow, drawn by his 2 oxen, cut through the thick mat of grass roots, turning over ribbons of black earth. It was slow work. In a good day, Harper could break perhaps 2 acres. He needed to break 40 acres to have enough cropland to support his family and prove to the government that he was improving his claim. The first frost came on October 15th. Harper was plowing when he noticed the temperature dropping, the wind shifting to come from the north. By evening, ice crystals formed on the water bucket outside the dugout door. Mary brought the children inside and closed the door against the cold. Inside the dugout, something remarkable happened. The temperature barely changed. While the outside air dropped to near freezing, the dugout remained comfortable. Not warm exactly, but not cold either. The thick earth walls, buried in the hillside, held their temperature steady. The heat from the cooking fire, vented through the simple chimney Harper had constructed, warmed the interior air. But even without a fire, the dugout stayed tolerable. "It's not cold in here," Emma observed, stating the obvious, but still surprised by it. "Earth holds steady," Harper explained. "Frost can't penetrate through all that dirt. The temperature of the ground stays near the average yearly temperature, probably around 50 degrees. That's why root cellars work. Same principle." November brought the first real test. A storm swept across the plains, wind howling at 40 miles an hour, temperature plunging to 10 degrees above zero. Snow fell, not the gentle flakes of an Ohio winter, but hard-driving snow that came almost horizontal in the wind, stinging any exposed skin like needles. Henderson's timber house creaked and groaned in the wind. The boards, not perfectly fitted, let in drafts that made candle flames dance and gutter. Henderson and his family huddled around their stove, burning through their supply of firewood at an alarming rate. Even with the fire roaring, the corners of the house remained cold, frost forming on the inside of the walls where the cold seeped through. In Harper's dugout, the family barely heard the wind. The earth walls dampened the sound to a distant moan. No drafts whistled through cracks. The temperature inside remained steady, hovering in the low 60s. Harper burned a small fire for cooking and to take the chill off the air, but he didn't need the roaring fire that Henderson was burning through. The storm lasted 3 days. When it ended, Henderson rode over to check on the Harpers, expecting to find them suffering, perhaps to offer them refuge in his house. Instead, he found Harper outside, clearing snow from the path to his small barn where he kept his oxen. "You made it through all right?" Henderson asked, surprised. "Just fine," Harper said. "Dugout held steady. How about you?" Henderson admitted he'd burned through a week's worth of firewood in 3 days. His children had huddled in blankets because the corners of the house stayed cold despite the fire. His wife was exhausted from trying to keep the house warm. "How's your firewood supply holding?" Henderson asked, a note of concern in his voice. Everyone knew that fuel was a critical resource on the plains, where wood was scarce. "Haven't used much," Harper said honestly. "Don't need much of a fire. Dugout stays warm on its own." Henderson looked at the hillside, at the grass-covered roof barely distinguishable from the surrounding prairie, at the small door and single window. He'd spent 3 months mocking this dugout, calling it a hole in the ground, pitying the Harper family for their poverty. Now he was beginning to wonder if he'd been wrong. December brought more storms. The winter of 1867-1868 was brutal across Nebraska, with blizzards sweeping down from the north, temperatures dropping below zero for days at a time. Snow piled in drifts 15 feet high. The wind never seemed to stop blowing. The Harpers stayed warm in their dugout. The interior temperature fluctuated between 55 and 65 degrees, depending on whether they had a fire going. They burned wood sparingly, using buffalo chips when they could find them, dried grass when necessary. Mary cooked over a small fire, baked bread in a Dutch oven, kept a pot of beans warming on the coals. The darkness was harder to deal with than the cold. Winter days were short, and inside the dugout they seemed even shorter. The single window let in limited light. The family went to bed early and rose late, conserving candles and lamp oil. Mary sewed by firelight. Harper repaired tools and harness. The children played quiet games in the dim interior. But they were warm, they were dry, they were safe. Henderson's house, by contrast, was a constant battle against the elements. Every blizzard found new cracks, new gaps in the timber walls. The wind drove snow through openings they didn't know existed. Frost formed thick on the inside of the walls in the coldest weather. The family burned through their entire winter's supply of firewood by January and had to start burning furniture to stay warm. Other homesteaders on surrounding claims fared worse. A family named Miller, who'd built a small cabin from cottonwood logs, found that cottonwood made poor building material. The logs warped and split in the cold, creating gaps that let in wind. The Millers spent the winter stuffed into every piece of clothing they owned, sleeping under every blanket they had, still shivering. The Johnson family, who'd built a claim house from rough planks, found that their walls provided almost no insulation. The temperature inside their house was rarely more than 5 or 10 degrees warmer than outside. They burned through fuel at an incredible rate and still stayed cold. But in the dugout, the Harper family stayed comfortable. Not luxurious, not warm by the standards of a heated house back east, but comfortable enough. The earth itself was doing the work of insulation, moderating temperature, blocking wind, providing shelter. On January 12, 1868, the temperature outside dropped to 20 below zero. A blizzard howled for 2 days straight, visibility reduced to nothing, snow driven horizontal by 60-mile-an-hour winds. This was the kind of storm that killed people who got caught in it. Homesteaders who'd been out checking on livestock when such storms hit had died within yards of their own houses, unable to see through the driving snow. The Harper family stayed inside. They had no choice. The door was drifted shut with snow, and Harper had to dig out from inside. But the dugout itself remained at 60 degrees. The fire in the small stove warmed the air, but even without it, the temperature would have stayed well above freezing. Mary cooked pancakes on the stove, using the last of their flour. They'd been in the dugout for 4 months, and their supplies were running low. Harper would need to make a trip to the settlement for provisions once the weather cleared, but for now they managed on what they had. Beans, cornmeal, a bit of salt pork. It wasn't luxury, but it was enough. When the storm finally broke on January 14th, Henderson came riding over again. His face was haggard, his eyes red from smoke and lack of sleep. "James," he said, "I need to ask you something." "Ask away," Harper said. "How much would you charge to help me dig a dugout?" Harper was surprised. "You've got a house." "A cold house," Henderson said. "A house that eats through firewood like nothing I've ever seen. My family's been cold all winter, despite burning everything we can get our hands on. You telling me your dugout's warmer?" "Stays about 60 degrees most of the time," Harper said. "Doesn't matter how cold it gets outside, the earth holds steady." Henderson looked at the hillside, reconsidering everything he'd assumed about proper shelter. "I mocked you," he said quietly. "Called you a prairie dog, told everyone you were living like an animal. I was wrong." "No offense taken," Harper said. "You want help digging a dugout?" "Not for me," Henderson said. "Too proud to give up my house, but my brother's coming out this spring. I want to advise him right. Should he build what I built, or should he do what you did?" Harper considered this. "Depends on his money and his priorities. If he's got money for lumber and doesn't mind the fuel costs, a timber house is nice. More light, more space. But if he's short on cash and wants to stay warm without burning through his winter's fuel in a month, a dugout makes more sense." Henderson nodded slowly. "I'll tell him that. Thank you, James." Word spread through the settlement. The dugout that people had mocked in August was now the talk of the winter. How had the Harper family stayed warm with so little fuel? How had they survived the blizzards that had nearly frozen other families in their timber houses? The answer was simple. The earth itself was providing insulation. The temperature of the ground at a depth of 6 feet stays relatively constant year-round, hovering near the average annual temperature for the region. In Nebraska, that meant the earth stayed around 50 to 55 degrees throughout the winter. The dugout, buried into the hillside with thick earth walls, maintained this temperature naturally. A small fire could raise the interior temperature to 65 degrees with minimal fuel consumption. By comparison, a timber house sat exposed to the winter wind. The thin board walls provided minimal insulation. Cold air infiltrated through every crack and gap. Maintaining a comfortable interior temperature required massive amounts of fuel, burning constantly. Even then, the temperature near the walls might be 20 degrees colder than the temperature near the stove. But the dugout had problems too, and as winter wore on, the Harper family discovered them. The first problem was darkness. The single small window admitted very little light, even on the sunniest days, and during storms or at night, the interior was nearly black. The family lived by candlelight and firelight. Their world shrunk to the small circle of illumination around the flames. The second problem was moisture. Earth walls naturally contain moisture, and in the enclosed space of the dugout, this moisture accumulated. Condensation formed on the ceiling dripped down onto the furniture, created a perpetual dampness that was hard to eliminate. Mary hung sheets on ropes across the ceiling to catch the drips, wringing them out daily. She aired out bedding whenever the weather allowed, fighting a constant battle against the damp. The third problem was critters. Mice burrowed into the earth walls and ceiling. Spiders made homes in every corner. Occasionally, snakes would emerge from the walls, attracted by the warmth. Harper killed 3 snakes over the course of the winter, and Mary found the experience unnerving. She never knew when she might encounter another one. The fourth problem was the ceiling itself. The cottonwood poles and sod roof, while effective at keeping out weather, occasionally shed dirt. Small bits of earth would sift down through the grass layer, landing on the table during meals, falling into the water bucket, coating everything in a fine layer of dust. Mary swept daily, but the dirt kept coming. Despite these problems, the dugout was a success. It had kept the family warm through a brutal winter. It had required minimal fuel, and most importantly, it had been built for almost no money. Harper had spent $5 on the door and window, and perhaps $2 on nails and a few other supplies. His total investment was $7 compared to the $60 or $70 a timber house would have cost. Spring came late in 1868. The last blizzard hit on March 15th, a late-season storm that dumped another foot of snow on the prairie. But by April, the snow was melting, the creeks were running high, and the prairie grass was beginning to green up. Harper emerged from his dugout with one goal in mind. He needed to plant crops. The broken sod from the previous fall had weathered through winter, freezing and thawing, breaking down into workable soil. Now, in April, Harper could plant. He chose corn, the reliable crop of the prairie. With his oxen and a simple plow, he planted 40 acres of corn, dropping seed into furrows, covering it, moving to the next row. The work consumed every daylight hour through April and into May. Mary and the older children helped when they could, but much of the labor fell on Harper's shoulders. He plowed, he planted, he prayed for rain. The rains came in May, steady, gentle rains that soaked into the soil without washing away the seed. The corn germinated, pushed through the soil, grew into rows of green across the black earth. By June, the crop looked promising. By July, the corn was head-high and healthy. Other homesteaders weren't so fortunate. The Miller family, who'd spent all their resources on their cottonwood cabin and had little left for seed, managed to plant only 10 acres. The Johnson family, who'd burned through their fuel and had to buy more at high prices, had no money left for a full planting. They planted 15 acres and hoped it would be enough. Henderson, with his timber house and better financial situation, planted 50 acres and looked likely to have a good harvest. But Henderson had also spent far more money to get to this point. His house had cost him $70. His fuel bills over the winter had run another $20. He'd spent nearly $100 before planting a single seed. Harper's total expenditure was still under $20, including supplies, seed, and everything else. The dugout had saved him significant money, money that would matter when it came time to buy livestock, improve his claim, and build for the future. Summer brought a new challenge to the dugout. The same earth walls that had kept the family warm in winter now kept them cool in summer, which sounds pleasant, but created its own issues. When July temperatures soared above 90 degrees, when the prairie sun beat down mercilessly, the dugout stayed a comfortable 65 degrees. This was wonderful for escaping the heat, but it meant the dugout was damp and dark at the time of year when everyone else could open windows and doors and let in light and air. Mary solved this by doing most of her work outside during summer. She cooked over an outdoor fire, using the dugout stove only in the worst weather. She did laundry at the creek. She sat in the shade of the wagon to do her sewing. The children played outside from dawn to dusk, coming into the dugout only to sleep. The dugout, designed for winter survival, was less ideal for summer living. But it was still serviceable, and on the hottest days, the family appreciated the cool interior as a refuge from the scorching sun. Harvest came in September. Harper's corn crop yielded well, 30 bushels per acre, 1,200 bushels total. At 50 cents per bushel, this meant $600 gross income. After setting aside enough seed corn for next year's planting and keeping enough to feed his family and his oxen through the winter, Harper had 800 bushels to sell. He loaded his wagon and made the 40-mile trip to Omaha, where he sold the corn to a grain merchant. He returned with $400 in cash, more money than he'd had when he arrived on his claim a year earlier. After expenses, after buying supplies for winter, after setting aside money for next year's seed, he still had $300. This was prosperity by homesteading standards. Henderson had a good harvest too, but his expenses had been higher. After paying for his lumber, his fuel, his supplies, he came out with about the same profit as Harper, despite having a larger crop. The Miller family, with their small planting, barely broke even. The Johnson family, after their expenses, ended up in debt to the merchant who'd extended them credit for supplies. As the second winter approached, Harper faced a decision. He now had money. He could buy lumber and build a proper house. Many homesteaders did exactly this, building dugouts for their first year, then upgrading to frame houses once they had cash from their first harvest. But Harper looked at his dugout and saw something his neighbors didn't. He saw a home that had kept his family warm through the worst winter Nebraska could throw at them. He saw a shelter that had required minimal fuel, minimal maintenance, minimal ongoing cost. And he saw an opportunity to save his money for other purposes. "We're staying in the dugout another year," Harper announced at dinner one evening in October. Mary looked up from her sewing. "Another year?" "Maybe 2, Harper said. "Maybe 3. Until we've got enough money saved to build exactly the house we want, not just the house we can afford right now." Emma, now 9 years old, spoke up. "I'd like a house with more windows. It's so dark in here." "I know," Harper said, "and we'll have that, but not yet. Right now, every dollar we save is a dollar toward our future, toward better livestock, toward more land, toward the house we really want." Mary considered this. She'd grown accustomed to the dugout over the past year, adapted to its limitations, learned to live with the darkness and dampness. Another year or two wouldn't kill her, and the financial sense of Harper's plan was undeniable. "All right," she said, "we'll stay." So the Harper family spent a second winter in their dugout. This winter was milder than the first, but still cold, with temperatures dropping below zero multiple times and several significant blizzards. Once again, the dugout kept them warm with minimal fuel. Once again, Henderson and other neighbors burned through their fuel supplies, struggling to heat their above-ground houses. By the second spring, something had changed in the settlement. New homesteaders arriving from the east, hearing about the harsh winters, were asking about dugouts. How were they built? How well did they work? Was it true that you could stay warm with almost no fuel? Harper found himself giving advice to newcomers, explaining the principles of dugout construction, where to locate it, how to dig it, how to build the front wall and roof, how to manage moisture and darkness. He'd become an expert in something he'd known nothing about 2 years earlier. Some of the new arrivals built dugouts. Others built timber houses, deciding they'd rather pay for fuel than live underground. But increasingly, dugouts were seen as a practical first shelter, a way to survive the first winter while saving money for a better house later. Henderson, watching this shift in attitudes, admitted to Harper one day in the spring of 1869, "You were ahead of the curve. Rest of us thought you were making a mistake. Turns out you were making the smart play." "Just trying to survive," Harper said. "Same as everyone." "Some survive better than others," Henderson observed. "You're thriving while the Millers are talking about giving up their claim and heading back east. The Johnsons are so far in debt they might never get out. But you've got cash in the bank and a crop in the ground." Harper didn't gloat. He knew that survival on the plains was partly skill, partly planning, partly luck. He'd been fortunate with good harvests. Another family might face drought or hail or grasshoppers and lose everything through no fault of their own. But he also knew that his decision to build a dugout instead of a timber house had given him financial flexibility that other families lacked. The second harvest in 1869 was even better than the first. Harper expanded his planting to 60 acres and got good yields. He sold corn for more money, saved more money, built up his herd by buying 2 cows and a pig. The family ate better, the children wore better clothes. Mary had fabric for new dresses and curtains. They were, by pioneer standards, doing well. In the fall of 1869, Harper made his decision. He would build a house. Not immediately, but in the spring of 1870, after 2.5 years in the dugout, he would build the house he'd always planned for. But he wouldn't abandon the dugout. Many homesteaders did exactly that, building new houses and simply walking away from their dugouts, letting them collapse or fill with dirt. Harper had a different idea. He would keep the dugout and convert it into a root cellar. Root cellars were essential on the plains. Without them, produce couldn't be stored through winter. Potatoes, carrots, turnips, beets all needed cool, dark storage to prevent sprouting or freezing. The dugout, with its constant 50-degree temperature, was perfect for this purpose. So in the winter of 1869-1870, Harper spent his spare time improving the dugout for its new purpose. He built shelves along the walls for storing vegetables. He dug a deeper pit in the floor for storing root crops and sand. He improved the door to make it more weathertight. By spring, the dugout was no longer a home but a functional root cellar. Construction of the new house began in April 1870. This time, Harper didn't build alone. He'd made friends among the homesteaders, and frontier custom meant that neighbors helped with major construction projects. Henderson came over with his wagon and hauled lumber from Omaha. Another neighbor, Peterson, who'd finally succeeded with his homestead after the flooding disaster with his first dugout, helped with the framing. The Johnson family, still struggling but hanging on, sent their oldest son to help with the raising. Harper's new house was modest by the standards of Eastern homes, but it was a mansion compared to the dugout. 2 rooms, 12 by 16 feet each. A real wooden floor, 4 glass windows, a proper door with a lock, board and batten walls, a shingled roof, a stone chimney. The house sat on the prairie about 50 yards from the dugout, positioned to catch the morning sun and shelter from the north wind. Harper had learned about siting from his dugout experience and applied those lessons to his house. The cost was significant. Lumber, windows, doors, nails, shingles, everything together ran to $90. But Harper had the money, saved over 2.5 years of careful management. He paid cash for everything, owed nothing to merchants, had no debt. The Harper family moved into their new house on June 15, 1870. For the first time in nearly 3 years, they lived above ground in a proper house. The children ran from room to room, marveling at the space, the light, the wooden floors. Mary set up her kitchen in one room, the sleeping quarters in the other, arranged furniture, hung curtains. It was, by any measure, a step up in the world. But they didn't forget the dugout. All summer, as Mary's garden produced, they stored food in the cool darkness of their former home. Potatoes by the bushel, carrots, turnips, beets, onions, crocks of butter kept cool in the constant temperature, barrels of apples purchased from a traveling merchant. The dugout as a root cellar proved just as valuable as it had been as a home. That winter of 1870-1871, the Harper family experienced their first winter in an above-ground house. It was a revelation. The windows let in light. The space felt larger. The floors stayed clean without dirt sifting from the ceiling. The air felt fresh, but the house was also cold. Despite Harper's best efforts at construction, despite fitting the boards as tightly as possible, cold air infiltrated. The stove had to burn hot to keep the house warm. Harper found himself cutting wood constantly, hauling it from the creek bottom, burning through his supply at a rate that worried him. The house never got as cold as Henderson's house because Harper had built more carefully, fitted everything tighter, used better materials. But it was still significantly colder than the dugout had been. Harper estimated he was burning 3 times as much wood to keep the house at 65 degrees as he'd burned to keep the dugout at the same temperature. In the darkest part of winter, when a blizzard howled for 3 days straight and the temperature outside dropped to 25 below, Harper found himself thinking about the dugout. Down there, beneath the earth, the temperature would be holding steady at 55 degrees with no fire at all. Up here, in his new house, he was burning wood as fast as he could cut it, just to keep his family from shivering. "Do you regret building the house?" Mary asked one evening, watching Harper stoke the fire for the 3rd time that day. "No," Harper said, though he paused before answering. "The house is better, more light, more space, cleaner. But the dugout had its advantages. I'll give it that." "We survived 2 winters in the dugout," Mary said. "We can afford the wood for the house." She was right, of course. Harper's corn harvests had been good. His herd was growing. He had cash reserves. The cost of firewood, while significant, wasn't going to bankrupt them, but he couldn't help calculating the expense, comparing it to the virtually fuel-free winters in the dugout. By 1875, the Harpers had been on their claim for 8 years. They'd proved up their homestead, received the deed, owned the land outright. Harper had expanded his operations, planting 80 acres of corn and 20 acres of wheat. He had 6 cows, a team of horses, 2 pigs, and a flock of chickens. The house had been expanded with an additional room. The children were growing. Emma was 15, James 13, Sarah 11. The settlement had grown too. What had been scattered homesteads in 1867 was now a small community with a church, a school, a general store, and a grain elevator. The railroad had extended a spur line, making it easier to ship crops to market. Many of the original homesteaders had succeeded and stayed. Others had given up and left. Still others had arrived, tried, failed, and moved on. Henderson was still there, now farming 240 acres with his brother, who had indeed built a dugout for his first year before constructing a house. The Johnson family had finally gotten out of debt and was doing reasonably well. Peterson, the man who'd flooded his first dugout, had become one of the most successful farmers in the area, known for his innovative techniques and careful management. One afternoon in the spring of 1875, a family arrived from Iowa, looking to homestead on a nearby claim. They stopped at Harper's farm to ask advice. The father, a man named Williams, looked around at Harper's well-established operation and asked the question that every new homesteader asked: "What's the first thing I should do?" Harper didn't hesitate. "Build a dugout." Williams looked surprised. "Not a house?" "Eventually, yes," Harper said. "But first, build a dugout. Get yourself shelter fast and cheap. Save your money for seed, livestock, tools. Survive your first winter warm without going broke on firewood. Then, when you've got a crop in and money coming in, build your house." "I've heard dugouts are miserable," Williams said. "Dark, damp, full of critters." "They're all those things," Harper admitted. "But they're also warm in winter, cool in summer, cheap to build, and they work. My family lived in a dugout for nearly 3 years. Those 3 years gave us the financial foundation for everything we have now." Williams walked over to the old dugout, now serving as the Harper's root cellar. He peered inside, seeing the earth walls, the stored vegetables, the cool darkness. "And you really stayed warm in winter?" "Warmer than in my house now," Harper said honestly. "The earth holds temperature steady, 60 degrees, give or take, year-round. In winter, that feels warm. In summer, that feels cool. It's nature's insulation." Williams nodded slowly, thinking it over. "All right," he said finally. "I'll dig a dugout first. Where should I put it?" Harper spent the next hour explaining the principles he'd learned. Find a hillside that faces east for morning sun. Make sure it's high enough to avoid flooding. Slope the floor slightly toward the entrance for drainage. Build the front wall solid. Use sod if you don't have money for lumber. Make the roof thick, at least a double layer of sod over grass over poles. Keep it simple. Keep it cheap. Keep it functional. Williams thanked him and rode off to locate a site on his claim. Harper watched him go, remembering his own arrival 8 years earlier, the mockery from neighbors, the doubt about whether a hole in the ground could really serve as a home. "You're sending another family underground," Mary observed, joining Harper on the porch. "I'm giving them the same advantage we had," Harper said, "a chance to survive without going broke, a chance to save money for the future. The dugout bought us our start. Now we've got land, livestock, crops, money in the bank, all because we didn't spend ourselves poor on a fancy house the first year." Mary looked at the old dugout, sitting there in the hillside, grass waving on its roof, door open to the cool interior. "I hated that dugout when we first moved in," she said quietly. "It was dark and damp, and I thought we'd made a terrible mistake. But you were right. It was exactly what we needed." "It was shelter," Harper said simply. "Effective, affordable shelter. That's all it needed to be." Over the next several years, Harper's advice about dugouts spread through the region. New homesteaders, hearing about his success, chose to build dugouts first, rather than immediately constructing frame houses. The pattern was repeating across the Great Plains, from Kansas to Nebraska to the Dakotas. Dugouts became the standard first shelter for homesteaders without significant capital. Not everyone succeeded. Some families couldn't adapt to the darkness and dampness of dugout living. Some chose poor locations and flooded out. Some built poorly and suffered through cold winters anyway. But for those who built carefully, chose locations wisely, and managed their expectations, dugouts provided exactly what was needed, a way to survive the brutal plains winters without going bankrupt. By the 1880s, as more railroads reached across the plains and lumber became more accessible, dugouts began to decline. Homesteaders with more resources could afford to build frame houses immediately. Those who'd started in dugouts upgraded to better housing. The era of the dugout as primary shelter was ending. But the dugouts themselves didn't disappear. They were converted to root cellars, storm shelters, storage sheds. They remained useful even after families moved into houses. Harper's dugout served as his root cellar for 20 years, keeping vegetables fresh through winters, storing butter and milk in summer, providing the same constant temperature that had once kept his family warm. In 1890, a historian from the Nebraska Historical Society came to interview old-time homesteaders about their experiences settling the plains. He talked to Harper, now 53 years old, and one of the most established farmers in the county, about those early years. "Tell me about your first shelter," the historian asked. "I built a dugout," Harper said. "Dug it right into that hillside there." He pointed to the old structure, still functional as a root cellar 23 years after construction. "And how was it living underground?" Harper considered the question carefully. "It was dark. It was damp. Dirt fell from the ceiling. Mice lived in the walls. My wife had to catch drips from the ceiling in sheets. The children complained about not having space to play. It wasn't comfortable by the standards we'd known back east." The historian wrote this down, nodding sympathetically. "But," Harper continued, "it kept us warm through two of the worst winters I've ever seen. It cost me $7 to build. It required almost no firewood to heat. It gave us shelter while we saved money for everything else we needed. It was the foundation of everything we've built since." "Would you recommend it to others?" the historian asked. "I already have," Harper said. "Dozens of homesteaders have asked my advice over the years. I always tell them the same thing. Build a dugout first, get shelter fast and cheap, survive your first winter, save your money, then build your dream house with cash in hand, not with debt on your back." The historian's report, published in 1891, included Harper's story among others. It documented the dugout as a crucial but temporary stage in plains settlement, a practical solution to the challenge of providing shelter in a treeless environment with minimal resources. Harper lived until 1912, 45 years after arriving on his Nebraska homestead. By the time of his death, his farm had grown to 400 acres. He'd seen the plains transformed from open prairie to cultivated farmland, had watched the railroad bring prosperity, had witnessed the rise of towns and cities where only grass had grown when he'd arrived. But among all his accomplishments, the one thing people remembered was his dugout. Long after it had collapsed back into the hillside, long after frame houses had replaced every dugout in the county, People still told the story of James Harper, the man who'd been mocked for living in a hole, but who'd proven that sometimes the simplest solution was the smartest one. The dugout hadn't been a joke. It had been survival strategy, financial planning, and practical engineering wrapped into one dirt-walled structure. It had kept a family warm without a conventional roof, not through magic or miracle, but through the simple physics of Earth's insulating properties. Settlers had thought Harper's shelter was a joke. They'd called him a prairie dog, questioned his judgment, pitied his family. But when winter came and proved the dugout's worth, when Harper's family stayed warm while others shivered, when his bank account grew while others went into debt, the joke was revealed to be wisdom. The story of Harper's dugout is the story of thousands of homesteaders who made similar choices across the Great Plains in the decades after the Civil War. Some of these families succeeded, others failed, but all of them faced the same fundamental challenge: how to provide shelter in an environment where traditional building materials were scarce or expensive. The dugout was an answer. Not the only answer, not the best answer for everyone, but an effective answer for those who chose it wisely. It bridged the gap between arrival and establishment, between poverty and prosperity, between hope and reality. In museums across Nebraska, Kansas, and the Dakotas, reconstructed dugouts stand as monuments to this era. Visitors duck into the dark interiors, feel the cool earth walls, imagine families living in these cramped spaces. They marvel at the hardship, question how anyone survived, wonder at the determination required to endure such conditions. But those who understand the history know the truth. The dugout wasn't just hardship. It was strategy. It was the shelter that stayed warm without a roof, the home that cost almost nothing, the foundation upon which the settlement of the Great Plains was built. And for families like the Harpers, it was the difference between success and failure, between staying and leaving, between building a future and giving up on a dream. The settlers thought Harper's shelter was a joke, but Harper had the last laugh, along with the warm winters, the saved money, and the farm that grew into a legacy lasting generations. That was the real lesson of the dugout. Sometimes the solution that looks the least appealing is actually the most effective. Sometimes a hole in the ground is exactly what you need. And sometimes staying warm doesn't require a roof at all. It just requires understanding how the earth itself can provide shelter.